The early morning sunlight streamed through the massive windows of Atlanta International Airport, casting long shadows across the polished floors. James Richardson walked through the terminal with his carry-on bag, dressed in comfortable jeans and a navy blue sweater, looking just like any other passenger heading home after a long week. What most people didn't know as they rushed past him was that James had spent the last 15 years in the cockpit, not the cabin. He'd flown everything from rescue missions in storms to commercial flights across continents. Today, though, he was just another traveler using his airline benefits to visit his family in Chicago. The terminal buzzed with its usual morning energy, parents wrangling excited kids, business people clutching their coffee cups, and tourists dragging oversized luggage. James smiled, remembering his first time in an airport as a wide-eyed 10-year-old, clutching his father's hand and dreaming of someday flying those giant metal birds himself. He stopped at his favorite coffee shop in Terminal B, ordering his usual, a simple black coffee with a splash of cream. The barista, an elderly woman with kind eyes, had served him countless times before when he was in uniform. Today, she didn't recognize him in his casual clothes, but her smile was just as warm. Flight 2317 to Chicago now boarding first-class passengers, the announcement echoed through the terminal. James gathered his things, taking one last sip of coffee before heading to his gate. He'd flown this route hundreds of times from the cockpit, knowing every air current and landmark along the way. It felt strange being on the other side, but he was looking forward to relaxing and maybe catching up on that book he'd been meaning to read. The gate area was crowded, filled with the usual mix of travelers. A young mother struggled with a stroller while trying to keep an eye on her toddler. Without hesitation, James stepped in to help her fold the stroller, earning a grateful smile. It was these small moments of human connection that he loved about his job, whether he was in uniform or not. Making his way down the jet bridge, James felt the familiar excitement he always experienced when boarding a plane. Even after all these years, flying never lost its magic for him. He remembered the words his flight instructor had told him years ago. The day you stop feeling that spark when you step onto a plane is the day you should find another job. 15 years later, the spark was still there. As he approached his seat in first class, James noticed a few curious glances from other passengers. He was used to it. Being one of the few black pilots at his airline meant he learned to navigate these moments with grace. He settled into his window seat, 2A, pulling out his book, a biography of the Tuskegee Airmen who had paved the way for pilots like him decades ago. The familiar sounds of boarding surrounded him, the shuffle of feet, the thunk of bags being stored overhead, the quiet murmur of conversations. A businessman in an expensive suit took the seat next to him, offering a polite nod before immediately burying himself in his phone. James turned back to his book, losing himself in the stories of those brave pilots who had fought not just enemies in the air, but prejudice on the ground. Little did he know that in just a few minutes, his peaceful journey would turn into something entirely unexpected, a moment that would test his professionalism, challenge his dignity, and ultimately reveal much more than he had planned about who he really was. Through the window, he could see the ground crew preparing the aircraft, their practiced movements a dance he knew by heart. He smiled, spotting a young ground crew member showing the same attention to detail he'd had when he first started. The pre-flight checks, the safety procedures, even from this side of the experience, he could appreciate the precision and care that went into every flight. The cabin crew began their preparations, moving through the cabin with practiced efficiency. James watched them work, appreciating their professionalism from a different perspective. He'd worked with countless crew members over the years, knowing exactly how crucial their role was in keeping passengers safe and comfortable. Today, though, he was content to be just another passenger, looking forward to a quiet flight to see his family. The morning sun had fully risen now, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. As more passengers filed past him to their seats in economy, James pulled out his phone to send a quick text to his mother, letting her know he was about to take off. "See you soon, Mom," he typed, adding a heart emoji that would make her smile. After all these years, she still worried about him every time he flew, whether he was in the cockpit or not. The cabin's familiar hum surrounded James as he settled deeper into his first-class seat, still absorbed in his book about the Tuskegee Airmen. The boarding process was nearly complete when he noticed a shift in the atmosphere around him. A flight attendant with perfectly styled hair and a crisp uniform was standing in the aisle, her eyes fixed on him with an expression he'd seen too many times before. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice carrying a note of forced politeness that made several nearby passengers look up from their phones. "I need to check your boarding pass." James reached for his phone, pulling up his digital boarding pass with the same calm he used during turbulent flights. "Of course," he replied, holding it up for her to see. The screen clearly showed his first-class seat assignment, 2A, along with his airline employee benefits status. The flight attendant's eyes narrowed slightly as she studied the boarding pass longer than necessary. "There seems to be some confusion," she said, her voice now loud enough for the entire first-class cabin to hear. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" A couple across the aisle exchanged uncomfortable glances. The businessman next to James shifted in his seat, pretending to be deeply engaged with his email, but clearly listening to every word. James could feel the weight of eyes on him, the familiar pressure of having to maintain composure in a situation where others might justifiably lose their cool. "Yes, I'm certain," James responded, his voice steady and professional. "I fly this route often." He didn't add that he usually sat in the cockpit, not the cabin. Years of experience had taught him that escalating situations rarely helped, even when you were in the right. The flight attendant's perfectly penciled eyebrows rose slightly. "Often," she repeated, her tone suggesting doubt. "Well, there must be some mistake with the system. These seats are usually reserved for our premium customers and airline employees." A young passenger a few rows back had already pulled out their phone, quietly recording the interaction. James noticed but kept his attention on the flight attendant. He trained countless crew members on maintaining professionalism under pressure, and now he found himself on the other side of that lesson. "I understand," he said, keeping his voice level. "I am an airline employee." He reached for his carry-on, planning to show his credentials, but the flight attendant held up her hand. "Let me get my supervisor," she said, already turning away. "We need to sort this out before takeoff." James noticed an elderly woman across the aisle shaking her head in disapproval, though whether at him or the flight attendant, he wasn't sure. A young professional woman 2 rows ahead had turned around completely in her seat, no longer pretending not to watch the scene unfold. As the flight attendant walked away, James took a deep breath. He thought about all the times he discussed situations like this with his younger cousins, teaching them how to handle prejudice with dignity. "Your reaction in these moments," he told them, "says more about you than their actions say about them." The businessman next to him finally looked up from his phone. "That was unprofessional of her," he said quietly, surprising James. "I've been flying first class for 20 years, and I've never been asked to verify my seat like that." James nodded in acknowledgement, appreciating the small gesture of support. Through the window, he could see another plane taking off, soaring into the morning sky with the same grace he'd always admired. It was ironic. Up there in the clouds, everyone was equal. It was only down here that people created these artificial divisions. He could hear hurried footsteps coming down the aisle, the supervisor, no doubt, along with the first flight attendant. James straightened in his seat, not out of nervousness, but from years of military and airline training. He'd learned long ago that moments like these were opportunities, not just to stand up for himself, but to educate others. A few rows ahead, a mother was explaining something quietly to her curious child, who had been watching the entire scene. James hoped she was using this moment as a teaching opportunity. In his experience, these situations could either reinforce prejudices or help break them down. The supervisor appeared, her name badge reading Lead Flight Attendant with polished authority. Her expression was stern but professional as she approached his seat. "Sir, I understand there's some confusion about your seating assignment," she began, holding a tablet. James reached for his bag again, knowing exactly what he needed to show them. 15 years of flying had taught him many things, but perhaps the most important lesson was this. Sometimes the best way to change perspectives was to shatter assumptions completely. The tension in the first-class cabin had reached a breaking point. More passengers had pulled out their phones, sensing they were witnessing something significant. The lead flight attendant stood firmly in the aisle, tablet in hand, while her colleague hovered nearby with an expression that mixed concern with stubborn certainty. "Sir," the lead flight attendant began, her voice carrying that special kind of forced patience. "We can offer you a seat in economy class to resolve this situation quickly. We're already behind on our departure time." She gestured toward the back of the plane, as if she was doing him a favor. James felt a familiar tightness in his chest, not from anger, but from the weight of responsibility. Every black professional he knew had stories like this, moments when they had to decide between standing up for themselves and keeping the peace. He thought about the young people he mentored, wondering what he would tell them to do in this situation. "I understand your concern about the departure time," James replied, his voice carrying the same steady authority he used during pre-flight briefings. "However, I will not be moving from my assigned seat." He reached again for his bag, but the first flight attendant stepped forward. "Sir, if you continue to be uncooperative, we'll have no choice but tow." "To what?" The quiet question came from the elderly woman across the aisle. She had removed her reading glasses and was staring at the flight attendants with clear disapproval. "To call security because a well-dressed gentleman is sitting in his assigned seat." The businessman next to James had finally put his phone away completely. "This is ridiculous," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I've been flying this airline for 20 years, and I've never seen anyone treated this way in first class." The lead flight attendant's professional mask slipped slightly. She turned to her colleague, speaking in what she probably thought was a whisper, but carried in the tense cabin, "Call ground support. We can't take off with this situation unresolved." A young passenger from a few rows back spoke up, their phone still recording. "I've got the whole thing on video. This is going straight to social media if you don't sort this out properly." James held up his hand, silencing the growing murmurs of support. In the cockpit, he'd learned that the calmest voice often had the most power. "Before you make that call," he said, finally reaching into his carry-on bag, "I think there's something you should see." The first flight attendant stepped closer, probably expecting to see a complaint form or perhaps a lawyer's business card. Instead, James pulled out his airline pilot's ID, complete with his captain's stripes and the airline's golden wings. But he wasn't done. Next came his Air Force veteran credentials, and finally his phone with a photo gallery open to pictures of him in the cockpit of various aircraft. "I'm Captain James Richardson," he said quietly, letting each word sink in. "I've been flying with this airline for 15 years. That's my plane out there at Gate C4, the one I just flew in from Denver this morning. And yes, this is my assigned seat, which I'm entitled to as an off-duty pilot visiting family in Chicago." The silence that followed was deafening. The lead flight attendant's tablet nearly slipped from her fingers. Her colleague's face had gone pale, then flushed deep red. The passengers who had been recording everything pressed in closer, knowing they were witnessing something extraordinary. I'm so sorry, Captain," the first flight attendant stammered, her earlier confidence evaporating. "We didn't realize." "That's rather the point, isn't it?" James replied, his voice gentle but firm. "We never really know who someone is just by looking at them. Every passenger on this plane deserves the same respect you'd show to a pilot, whether they're wearing the uniform or not." The lead flight attendant stepped forward, her face a mask of professional damage control. "Captain Richardson, please accept our sincere apologies. This is not how we train our staff to treat any passenger, let alone one of our most experienced pilots." Through the window, James could see the ground crew looking up at the plane, probably wondering about the delay. In all his years of flying, he'd learned that every incident, every moment of turbulence, was an opportunity for learning and growth. This one would be no different. A soft ripple of applause started somewhere in the back of first class and spread forward. The elderly woman across the aisle wiped a tear from her eye. The businessman next to him was shaking his head and smiling. Even the young child a few rows ahead was watching with wide, understanding eyes. The lead flight attendant turned to address the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. We'll be departing shortly." She paused, then added with genuine remorse, "And we're very fortunate to have Captain Richardson aboard with us today, even if he's not in the cockpit." As the flight attendants hurried away to prepare for takeoff, James sat back in his seat, his credentials still spread across his tray table. He thought about all the young people who dreamed of becoming pilots, especially those who might look like him. Sometimes, he realized, The most important flights weren't the ones you flew. They were the moments when you stood your ground, turned prejudice into understanding, and showed others that the sky truly was the limit for everyone. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the story of what had happened in first class spread throughout the cabin like wildfire. Flight attendants who hadn't been involved in the incident were now passing by James's seat with respectful nods, some stopping to quietly apologize for their colleagues' behavior. The businessman next to James had pulled up the airline's magazine, pointing to an article from 6 months ago. "I knew I recognized you from somewhere," he said, showing James a feature story about humanitarian missions. "You led that rescue operation during the Caribbean hurricane last year, didn't you?" James nodded modestly. "We had a great team," he said, remembering those intense days of flying supplies to isolated communities. On his phone, he pulled up photos that told a deeper story than his pilot's credentials alone. Images showed him coordinating with rescue teams, flying through challenging weather conditions, and delivering critical medical supplies to remote islands. A young flight attendant, different from the two involved in the incident, approached with a tablet. "Captain Richardson," she said warmly, "some passengers Googled you after what happened. They're asking if you're the same pilot who landed that plane safely during the engine failure over Colorado 2 years ago." More passengers leaned in as James pulled up news coverage from that day. The headlines told the story. "Hero pilot saves 157 lives in mid-air crisis." The video showed him at a press conference, deflecting praise and crediting his crew and years of training. Any pilot worth their wings would have done the same, he'd said then, and repeated now to his captivated audience. The elderly woman across the aisle had tears in her eyes again. "My grandson wants to be a pilot," she said softly. "But he's worried about things like what happened today." She paused, then added, "Would you mind if I took a picture of you to show him? He needs to see that it's possible." James agreed, understanding the importance of visible role models. As he posed for the photo, he shared stories about his journey, growing up watching planes from his backyard, working extra jobs to pay for flight school, and finally earning his wings in the Air Force. "Tell your grandson the sky belongs to everyone," he said, his words carrying the weight of experience. The young passenger who had recorded the earlier incident spoke up. "I found an interview you did about training programs for underprivileged youth," they said. "You've helped over 50 young people start their flying careers." James smiled, thinking of all the faces that had lit up in the cockpit during their first training flights. He pulled out his phone again, showing photos of graduation ceremonies, first solo flights, and proud moments when his students earned their wings. "The best way to change things," he explained, "is to open doors for others once you've made it through yourself." More photos emerged as he scrolled through his gallery, James receiving awards for his military service, speaking at aviation conferences, and working with community organizations. Each image told part of a larger story, not just of his personal achievements, but of his commitment to transforming the aviation industry. "During my first years of flying," he shared with the growing group of listeners, "I rarely saw anyone who looked like me in the cockpit. Now, when I walk through airports, young pilots of all backgrounds come up to say hello. That's real progress." The businessman checked his watch and looked surprised. "We've been in the air for almost an hour," he said. "This has been the most enlightening flight conversation I've ever had." A flight attendant who had been listening nearby stepped forward. "Captain Richardson," she said, "would you mind if I shared some of your story during our crew briefing? I think it could help prevent situations like this in the future." James agreed, pulling up one final photo, a group shot of his most recent graduating class of student pilots, their faces beaming with pride and possibility. "The most important thing to remember," he said, looking at each person who had gathered around his seat, "is that excellence doesn't wear a uniform all the time. Sometimes it's wearing jeans and a sweater, just trying to get home to family." As the conversation naturally wound down, James noticed something had changed in the cabin. The earlier tension had transformed into something powerful, a shared understanding that they'd all witnessed not just an incident, but a moment of genuine change. Through his window, the landscape below rolled past, cities, towns, and open country, all connected by the same sky he'd dedicated his life to navigating. In that moment, James realized that sometimes the most important destinations weren't marked on any map. They were the moments when prejudice gave way to understanding, when closed doors opened, and when one person's dignity became everyone's lesson in humanity. As the flight continued toward Chicago, James's mind drifted back to where his journey began. The small house near the airport where he grew up, his bedroom window perfectly positioned to watch planes taking off and landing. He remembered pressing his face against the glass, following each aircraft until it disappeared into the clouds, dreaming of the day he'd be up there too. His father, a mechanic at a local garage, had noticed his fascination early on. Every Sunday after church, they'd drive to the airport observation deck. "Watch how they move," his father would say, pointing out different aircraft. "Each one has its own story, just like each pilot has their own path." Those words had stuck with him through every challenge that followed. The memory of his first flight lesson surfaced clearly, him at 16, working double shifts at the local grocery store to save up for it. The instructor had looked surprised when he showed up, then skeptical, but James's preparation and determination had quickly won him over. "Kid," the instructor had said after that first flight, "you've got what it takes. Don't let anyone tell you different." High school teachers had tried to steer him toward more realistic careers, as they called them. But James kept his eyes on the sky, spending lunch breaks studying flight manuals and physics books in the library. His mother, a nurse working night shifts, would find him asleep at the kitchen table, aviation books spread out around him. "The Air Force Academy acceptance letter," he said quietly, almost to himself, remembering how his hands had shaken opening that envelope. The elderly woman across the aisle, still listening intently, leaned in closer. "Tell us about it," she encouraged, and James realized several passengers were still engaged in his story. "I was the first in my family to go to college," he shared. "The day I left for the academy, my whole neighborhood came out to say goodbye. People I barely knew were crying, hugging me, telling me I was carrying their dreams too." The academy years flashed through his mind. The grueling physical training, late nights studying aerodynamics, and the constant pressure of being one of the few black cadets in his class. "There were times I wanted to quit," he admitted. "But then I'd remember all those faces from my neighborhood, and somehow I'd find the strength to keep going." He pulled out his phone again, showing a photo of his graduation day. "Top of my class," he said, not bragging but stating a fact that had required thousands of hours of dedication. My dad couldn't stop smiling. He kept touching my wings like he couldn't believe they were real. The businessman, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. "How did you transition from military to commercial flying?" James's face lit up, remembering his early Air Force missions. "I flew everything they'd let me handle. Search and rescue, humanitarian aid, transport missions. Each flight taught me something new." He scrolled to photos of different aircraft he piloted, each one representing countless hours of experience. But the real turning point, he continued, was a rescue mission in Montana. Bad storm, 3 hikers stranded in the mountains. Everyone said the conditions were too dangerous to fly. I looked at the weather data and saw a narrow window of opportunity. The young passenger who had recorded the earlier incident was completely absorbed. "What happened?" "We got them out," James said simply. "That mission taught me that sometimes the biggest obstacle isn't the storm, it's people telling you something can't be done." He paused, remembering the faces of the rescued hikers. After that, commercial aviation felt like a natural next step. A different way to help people reach their destinations safely. The transition hadn't been easy. Even with his military record and exemplary skills, some interviewers had seemed surprised when he walked into their offices. But James had learned to let his expertise speak louder than their preconceptions. "My first commercial flight as captain," he recalled, pulling up another photo. "I made sure to walk through the cabin before takeoff, greeting every passenger. You should have seen some of their faces, especially the kids. One little boy asked his mother, 'We can be pilots too.' That's when I knew I had to do more than just fly." He showed them pictures of the mentorship program he'd started, teaching aviation basics to high school students from underserved communities. "Every time I see doubt in a young person's eyes, I remember my own journey. Sometimes all people need is someone to tell them it's possible." The photos continued, James teaching in simulators, speaking at career days, working with student pilots. Each image reflected his commitment to changing not just individual lives, but the entire aviation industry. "Last month," he said, showing a recent photo, One of my first students became a captain herself. When she called to tell me, we both cried. Because it wasn't just her achievement, it was proof that dreams really can take flight, no matter where you start from. As James finished sharing his story, the plane hit a small pocket of turbulence. Without thinking, he explained the weather pattern causing it, his pilot's instincts kicking in. Several passengers smiled, recognizing that they were in the presence of someone who had truly mastered their craft. Through the window, the afternoon sun painted the clouds in shades of gold. James thought about all the paths that had led him to this moment, not just his own journey, but the countless others who had broken barriers before him, making his flight possible. In their honor, he would continue to reach back, extend a hand, and help others soar. The video of what happened on Flight 2317 spread across social media like wildfire. By the time James landed in Chicago, his phone was buzzing with messages from friends, colleagues, and news outlets. The young passenger's recording had already been viewed millions of times, sparking intense discussions about prejudice in the airline industry. "Dad, you're trending," his daughter texted, sending screenshots of social media posts. People weren't just sharing the video, they were sharing their own similar experiences, creating a wave of conversations about discrimination in various professional fields. James sat in his mother's kitchen that evening, watching as major news networks picked up the story. His mom squeezed his shoulder as they watched clips of the incident. "You handled it just like your father would have," she said softly, pride mixing with a hint of sadness in her voice, with dignity. The airline's corporate office had already called multiple times. Their public relations team was in crisis mode, but James had a different vision for how to handle this situation. "This isn't about shaming anyone," he told the airline executives during a conference call. "It's about creating real change." Instead of pursuing legal action or demanding resignations, James proposed something different. "Let's turn this into a teaching moment," he suggested. "I want to help develop a new training program for airline staff, one that goes beyond basic diversity training and really helps people understand their unconscious biases." The young passenger who recorded the video had started a social media campaign, #RespectInTheSkies. People began sharing stories of times they'd been judged by their appearance in professional settings. Pilots, doctors, lawyers, and executives from various backgrounds stepped forward with their experiences. A week after the incident, James stood before a room full of airline executives and staff members. The 2 flight attendants from the incident were there too, looking nervous but ready to learn. "We're not here to point fingers," James began. "We're here to open eyes and minds." He shared stories from his career, not just the challenges, but the moments of connection and understanding. He talked about the senior pilot who'd become his mentor, looking past stereotypes to see his potential. He described the passengers who'd written letters of thanks after difficult flights, never knowing or caring about their pilot's race. "Every uniform begins as ordinary clothes," he told the room. "Every expert starts as a beginner. Every professional walks through life, sometimes dressed as an everyday person. The key is learning to see the humanity in everyone, regardless of their appearance." The airline responded with more than just words. They committed to a comprehensive overhaul of their training programs. James worked closely with their team, bringing in experts and incorporating real experiences from staff members of all backgrounds. Social media continued to amplify the message. A popular documentary filmmaker reached out, wanting to create a short film about James's journey from that little house by the airport to the captain's seat. But James had a better idea. He wanted to showcase the stories of other professionals who'd faced similar challenges. "This isn't just my story," he explained during a television interview. "This is about every kid who's been told they don't belong somewhere. Every professional who's had to prove themselves twice over. Every person who's had to navigate spaces where they're underrepresented." The incident sparked changes beyond just one airline. Other companies began reviewing their training procedures. Schools invited James to speak about perseverance and professionalism. Young people reached out through social media, sharing their dreams and asking for advice. One message particularly touched him, a photo of a young boy in an airport, pointing excitedly at the video of James that was playing on the news. "My son hasn't stopped talking about becoming a pilot since he saw your story," the parent wrote. "Thank you for showing him it's possible." 3 months after the incident, James stood before a new class of airline staff trainees. The room was more diverse than ever, filled with faces that reflected the changing face of aviation. "Your uniform doesn't make you professional," he told them. "Your actions do, and every interaction is a chance to show what true professionalism means." The flight attendants from the incident had become unexpected allies in the change process. They spoke openly about their learning experience, helping others recognize and address their own biases. "Sometimes the hardest part is admitting we need to change," one of them shared during a training session. "But when we do, we grow stronger as individuals and as a company." James kept the book about the Tuskegee Airmen in his flight bag, now with a new purpose. When crew members asked about it, he used it to start conversations about progress, how far we've come, and how far we still need to go. "The sky has never cared what we look like," he often said in his presentations. "It's time for all of us on the ground to learn that lesson too." The story could have ended in anger or legal battles. Instead, it became a catalyst for understanding, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful response to prejudice is education and grace. James had turned a moment of discrimination into a movement for change, proving that the highest form of professional expertise isn't just about skills, it's about helping others rise alongside you. 1 year after the incident on Flight 2317, James stood in front of a very different audience. The airline's new training center buzzed with energy as 20 young aspiring pilots from diverse backgrounds gathered for their first day of flight school. Each of them had been selected for a scholarship program that James had helped create, Wings for All. "Welcome to your first step toward the sky," James began, looking at their eager faces. He could see his younger self in each of them, the same dreams, the same determination, and yes, some of the same doubts he'd once carried. But these students would have something he didn't have at their age: a clear path forward and a support system designed to help them succeed. The training center itself was a testament to change. Modern flight simulators lined one wall, each one representing hundreds of hours of potential practice time. The walls displayed photos of pilots from all backgrounds, telling their unique stories of triumph over adversity. Among them was the famous photo from Flight 2317, now used as a teaching tool about professionalism and prejudice. "Last year, something happened that could have been just another sad story," James told the students. "Instead, it became a turning point." He walked among them, making eye contact with each person. "Today, you're not just starting your journey to become pilots. You're becoming part of a bigger change in aviation." The program he'd helped design went beyond just flight training. It included mentorship, professional development, and guaranteed interviews with major airlines upon completion. Several of the industry's biggest names had joined the initiative, recognizing that diversity in the cockpit wasn't just about fairness, it was about bringing the best talent into aviation. During the lunch break, James chatted with a young student who reminded him of himself. "I used to watch planes from my apartment window," the student shared. "But I never thought I'd get a chance to fly one until I saw your story." That afternoon, James took the students on a tour of a commercial aircraft. As they entered the cockpit, he noticed how their eyes lit up at the sight of all the instruments. "Every button, every switch here has a story," he explained. "Just like every one of you has a story that deserves to be heard." The flight attendants who had been involved in the original incident had become regular speakers at these training sessions. They shared their perspective on how unconscious bias can cloud judgment and how that single incident had transformed their understanding of professionalism. "Sometimes the hardest lessons leave the deepest impact," one of them told the students. "What matters isn't just the mistake, but how we grow from it." As part of the program, James had established partnerships with high schools across the country. Career days now included virtual cockpit tours and conversations with pilots from various backgrounds. The message was clear: the sky belongs to everyone. One wall of the training center displayed letters from children who had been inspired by the story. "Dear Captain," one read, "my teacher showed us your video in class. Now I know I can be anything I want to be." These letters served as daily reminders of why the program was so important. Later that afternoon, James led a session on handling challenging situations in the cockpit and beyond. "Technical skills are crucial," he explained, "but so is emotional intelligence. Sometimes the most important decisions you'll make won't be about navigation or weather, they'll be about how you handle moments of prejudice or doubt." The day ended with a surprise. The elderly woman from Flight 2317, the one who had asked for a photo for her grandson, appeared via video call. Her grandson was now enrolled in a similar program in another state. "You didn't just change one life that day," she told the students. "You started a chain reaction of change." Before dismissing the class, James shared one final thought. "Look around this room," he said. "A year ago, this program didn't exist. These opportunities weren't available. But because people chose to learn from a difficult moment instead of being defined by it, we're creating a new normal in aviation." The students gathered for a group photo, their faces beaming with possibility. Above them hung a banner with the program's motto, "The sky is not the limit, it's home." That evening, as James walked through the quiet training center, he paused by the wall of photos. His father's words echoed in his mind. Each plane has its own story, just like each pilot has their own path. Now, thanks to one challenging moment handled with grace and determination, those paths were becoming easier for others to follow. The next morning would bring another group of students, another chance to shape the future of aviation. But tonight, James took a moment to appreciate how far they'd come. The incident on Flight 2317 could have been just another story of discrimination. Instead, it had become a launchpad for real change, proving that sometimes the most powerful response to prejudice isn't anger, it's action. As he left the building, a plane took off overhead, its lights bright against the darkening sky. James smiled, knowing that somewhere up there, and in cockpits across the country, the face of aviation was changing. One flight, one student, one story at a time.